Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. Don't forget to subscribe to this show in your podcast app and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Thank you. Welcome back to Klassiki Podcast Season number 5. Thank you so much to all our returning listeners and welcome to any new ones. We've got another great 10 episodes lined up for you, featuring some exciting interviews, historical deep dives, and a Halloween special later this month. We're kicking things off with a topic that doesn't get enough of a look in here at Klassiki, which is science fiction. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about Boris and Arkady Strugatsky, two brothers who dominated Soviet sci-fi in the postwar era with their philosophical, subversive, and hugely popular novels and short stories. The Strugatskys also had a second life on screen, collaborating with a wide array of directors on adaptations of their work, most famously Andrei Tarkovsky in his masterpiece Stalker. You can't really understand Eastern Bloc sci-fi without the Strugatsky Brothers. But who were they? Where did their sci-fi visions come from? And why have they proven so appealing to so many filmmakers? To answer these questions, I spoke with Marat Greenberg. Marat is Professor of Russian and Humanities at Reed College in Oregon. He's written extensively on Soviet culture, with an emphasis on Jewish identity and experience under communism. Marat and I discussed the importance of the Strugatskys to Soviet sci-fi, the ways their work has been transformed by directors from the 1960s to the Putin era, and how their Jewishness informed their work. Subscribers can watch 2 Strugatsky adaptations on Klassiki now, Alexander Sokurov's Days of Eclipse and Grigory Kramanov's Dead Mountaineers Hotel. Links for those are in the show description. Marat, thanks so much for joining us on the Klassiki podcast.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So there's lots to talk about with the Strugatskys and with the Strugatskys and film. I'm sure we'll run out of time before we scratch the surface. But maybe we can just start with science fiction. And why are the Strugatskys so central to Soviet sci-fi? Why do they occupy such a privileged position in not just in literature, but also, stretching into things like film and so on?
Right. Great question. Yeah. So just to say more generally about sci-fi, it becomes incredibly important and prominent and popular in the Soviet Union during the thaw period. So the period of political, cultural reforms in the Soviet Union initiated by Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin's death, where you just had sort of, when I teach this stuff, I always tell my students, the window was just opened a little bit, and so kind of fresh air poured in, and that meant new books, new films, translations of foreign literature into Russian, into other languages, including sci-fi. And so that brought in the Renaissance in science fiction, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe more generally, especially in Poland. And so the Strugatskys became the kind of representative, of that wave of this Renaissance in Soviet sci-fi. They were the young authors. I'd say, yeah, kind of the most popular, both in terms of actual popularity, just in terms of kind of the fandom around their works, but also in terms of kind of the intellectual depth. But yeah, from that, like the early 1960s, end of 1950s until they continued writing well into the 80s, 90s, and Arkady, the older brother, dies first, and then Boris lives quite a bit longer than that and continued to write, under a pseudonym. And what made it really interesting, that sci-fi, is that on the one hand, they went back to the kind of avant-garde roots of sci-fi. So back to the 1920s, and a number of
Right.
the writers who were, either banned or just rediscovered during the thaw period in these absurdist writings, avant-garde writings. Uh, Also, they went back into 19th century Russian classics, where there is a speculative streak as well. If we think about something like Dostoevsky. And then they were really engaging with other sci-fi writers, from the West, adored American sci-fi. And then, as I said, kind of broader, socialist camp, where Poland was really important, and Stanislav Lem. I'm sure we'll talk more about him today.
Yeah, sure.
Another major writer. So they're right in the center, of that Renaissance, which means that some of the most interesting, books written in Russian in the second half of the 20th century are sci-fi, broadly speaking. I mean, maybe we can call it speculative, or what in Russian it's called научная фантастика, which translates into something like this: scientific fantastic.
Yeah, I always like that
Um,
that Russian term. It seems to open up extra kind of terrains that sci-fi doesn't. I
right,
think,
right.
yeah, the thing about the post-Stalinist Renaissance, like you're talking about there, I think it's important for people to understand is obviously, there's this need for like new types of heroes
Mm,
in Soviet culture. The heroes of the Stalinist era are obviously kind of tarnished, or some of them anyway.
right.
Like that system of values is obviously tarnished, and in science and technology, and then with the space race and cosmonauts, Gagarin and
Right.
so on, you start to get this. There's this new area that is kind of untarnished by the Stalinist past that people can
Yeah.
invest in, and I think the sci-fi kind of boom has a lot of its roots in that, and obviously the space race, which maybe goes
Right.
without saying, but we should probably mention it. That there was this huge kind of secular culture of investment in space travel.
Yes. Right. Absolutely. Right. And again, we're talking about the Soviet Union, which you can have all sorts of, reforms, but it remains a profoundly authoritarian state. And so, can what you just talked about, so sci-fi, the authorities were fine with that, precisely because it fit into this larger kind of political things that were happening, and the, competition with the West. But as they developed, and as in general, sci-fi of that period developed, it really became a subversive space, right?
Mm,
Which also meant that the Strugatskys, uh, they always had squabbles, and with the censors. But as you get further into their body of work, by the end of the 1960s and on, they have a real difficulty publishing their books, at least in the form that they would like to see them published. So some of them, are published in these very obscure venues, in very small quantities. Others are really redacted by the censor, and some, for instance, their major works, or what they saw as their masterpiece, The Doomed City, uh, is just not published at all. But certainly at the beginning, yes, it's space race, it's collaboration with the West, and the one hand, competition with the West. So yes, it definitely helped to turn sci-fi into that kind of cool thing. And some of the writers like Yefremov, for instance, who were very influential, and Strugatsky's did see him as, as their mentor. So he writes these utopian, books where he imagines the future of the world, where communism has triumphed, and there is a, kind of intergalactic harmony, that exists. And again, the Strugatskys like his books, but at the same time, as they become incredibly skeptical of the Soviet project at large and about human nature uh, in general, they certainly they step away from that, from that utopian vision.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we get a chance to get a little more into that kind of, I don't know, curdling of the Strugatskys worldview and their work, because I think it's a really interesting way of mapping what was going on, maybe more broadly in Soviet culture in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Well, we should get to the question of cinema, but I think first of all we should just pause a little on their biographies, individual and shared, just to kind of check in on what we need to know about the Strugatskys' lives. So, I mean, you tell me what you think is important to know. There's kind of a traumatic experience of the war.
Yes.
There's one studying English and Japanese and being this kind of more humanities teacher, translator, interpreter figure, and the other studying astronomy and having that more kind of hard scientific background. I mean, what do you think
Yeah.
we need to have in mind from their
Yeah. Great.
biographies?
Great. Yeah. So first I would say, the fact that they wrote pretty much all their works in tandem, that still remains a mystery how that was done, right? Especially because they claimed that, not a single, word was published sort of, first one was writing another one. It was all happening in tandem. So we're still, it's sort of, it remains a mystery, so that some kind of critics about them almost kind of this two-headed creature, the Strugatskys. But everything that you mentioned, I think, is really important for understanding them. Arkady, the older brother, by quite a few years, and Boris, the younger one. Their father was Jewish, their mother was Russian, and I think we'll get into that. Certainly, that played a large roles in their works and their lives. And the experience of World War II, right? They're in Leningrad,
Not the
and
best place to be during World War
not the
Two.
best place to be, of course. The siege of Leningrad, and Boris stays there with their mother, and survives just really by accident.
Yeah.
Of course, the incredible famine, and he just survived miraculously. He was, just as he was literally just dying from starvation. He was fed by by a neighbor, and just kind of stuffed into him. And so it was a miracle that he survived. Arkady, with their father, or rather, yes, with their father, they're able to leave Leningrad and also survive. Arkady survives, miraculously. The father dies. He basically like freezes to death.
Their train was bombed, right?
Right,
And
right, right.
Arkady is like one of the sole survivors. It's a real, like you say, a real kind of miraculous, a double miracle.
Yes, right. And later, I think it's Boris who writes later that like they shouldn't have survived, right? It's just a
Yeah,
miracle. Of course, it's true of so many of their generation, right? They're not
yeah, yeah.
unique. They're not unique in that respect. And so, as you mentioned, that Arkady becomes a translator from Japanese, and a really, really, really good one. And I think we're only now beginning to really kind of rediscover that aspect of his work. And I think had he stayed with that, he would have become one of the major translators of that literature into Russian. Boris, becomes an astronomer, so he's more within that scientific vein. And they were different by all accounts. They were very different personalities. First of all, Arkady was a very, very heavy drinker.
Hmm.
He essentially was an alcoholic. Boris was not. Boris was not. Their personalities were different. According to some, Arkady actually the more livelier one, and kind of the sort of the heart of the company, the conversation. Boris is more thoughtful one. According to others, it was the reverse, or at least became the reverse, and kind of Arkady becoming more pensive, and it's Boris who was, kind of the conversationalist. I should also say that since Arkady dies, he's the first to die, and then Boris lives really for quite a few, years after that. it's really through Boris that we know so much, that we know everything about them, at least what they were willing, what
Right. Yeah.
Boris wanted us to know about them. But certainly that experience of World War II, particularly the siege of Leningrad, and of the Holocaust,
Yeah.
was just an enormous part of their vision, of kind of the everything, how they saw themselves, how they saw their generation, and how they saw the world. And, in general, can that legacy of World War II, and in more subversive ways of the Holocaust, and we can, get more into that, is an essential component of the thought generation. Once you get, as early as, early 1960s, and you get, for instance, Hard to Be a God, one of
Yeah.
their major works. Um, things begin to change, and they realize that, again, the attempts that were allowed by the regime to come to terms with that Stalinist terror were incredibly limited.
Hmm.
And then that pessimism for them really translates into their vision of human nature and human history, right? So by the end, I would say that, yeah, they're profoundly pessimistic about about human beings.
Yeah. I mean,
And
a lot of their work, right, is about drawing different conclusions as time goes on, but it's about this question of progress and perfectibility
right.
of humanity and the conclusions that they draw using science fiction to kind of stage these philosophical debates about
Right.
whether you know about the idea of progress or enlightenment and so on, and like you say, drawing increasingly cynical conclusions, but they were actually really quite cynical quite early, as you point out. It did not take long for them to
No,
get there.
yes, absolutely right. And again, some of that had to do with sort of their roots, looking again in 19th century Russian literature, thinking about the 1920s. And as you said, yes, using sci-fi, often kind of the allegorical setup, sort of to think through these philosophical issues, political issues, existential issues, etc., where sort of science is really pushed to the corner. And in
Yeah.
that sense, they're quite different from, from Lem,
Yes.
Stanislav Lem.
Well, we should get to cinema.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, I think maybe we can get into some of the individual of their writings as we go along. But really, the big question, and maybe the most nebulous question that I have, is why is there such a profound relationship between the Strugatskys' work and cinema in the Soviet Union, but not only. I mean, why are they so adaptable to such a diverse range of filmmakers, and why are they appealing? I mean, those are two separate questions, maybe. I mean, what is it about them that managed to lend itself so well? Was it just that they were so popular, and therefore, it was natural that they would be adapted over and over, or was there something cinematic in their writing, if you like?
yeah, great question. And very interesting one, I think. I mean, one thing I would say is that, again, in general, if we think about this period, this kind of renaissance in sci-fi, as I said, it was kind of twofolded. There was literature on the one hand, there was cinema on the other, right? Of course, during the thaw period, cinema becomes incredibly important.
Yeah,
We really can look at that period as a sort of an equivalent to other new waves that we have,
absolutely.
French New Wave, but we can think about the kind of Central European, Czech cinema, Polish cinema during that period, and Klassiki. You've done a lot kind of in bringing that cinema to the viewer. Soviet cinema, of course, is smack right in the middle of it, and sci-fi. Sci-fi films were a huge part of it. Some of them were incredibly popular. We can think about, for instance, The Amphibian Man,
Ah,
based
great
on work
film.
by, yeah, great film by Belyaev, the early sci-fi author, really, really interesting. And so that film comes out in the 1960s, and it's just incredibly cool and weird. And it just, tons of people see it. And so there was definitely an attraction toward, sci-fi cinema during that period. And the Strugatsky stepped right into that. Why? Well, because it meant, I'd say it meant money. Yeah, I mean, writing scripts, and it became especially important as they were unable to publish their works, right?
Right,
They
right.
needed to look for sources of income, and so writing scripts, working with the studios. Also, there was definitely a camaraderie between writers and filmmakers. They all knew each other, they all hung out in the same circles, they were interested in the same things, right? And so it was just natural that they would be coming to each other. But having said that, and I was thinking prior to our conversation, it depends how we view adaptation, right? Of course, if you kind
Hmm.
of take a theoretical model and if you look at adaptation as really an interpretation, which is how I would look at it, and look at a film as its own independent work of art, and then a book as its own independent thing. At the same time, the idea of fidelity to the text is important, and I think for a majority of the viewers, when they look at an adaptation, they begin to compare the film to the book, right? In that respect, all the major adaptations of the Strugatsky's work, I mean, certainly by Tarkovsky or by Sakurov, these are incredibly loose you
Yeah.
know, ad adaptations. I wouldn't even call them adaptations. They're just sort of inspired, by the Strugatsky's work, even though in both cases, in the case of this Tarkovsky, in the case of Sakurov, Strugatsky's wrote the script.
Yeah.
Uh, sometime, I mean, it's going through an incredibly painful, certainly with Tarkovsky, incredibly painful and meticulous process where they were just turning a script after script after script. And of course, we're talking about, Stalker, that is based on their novel Roadside Picnic, and finally giving to Tarkovsky what he wanted, which meant that it had very, very, very little to do with either the plot, of their work or actually what, they were getting in there. And they acknowledged that. Tarkovsky was doing his own thing and they respect it, maybe even admire it. Sakurov was doing his own thing, and again, they respect it and admire it while recognizing that it has very, very little to do, what they were doing, right?
I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? That because even people, cinephiles with very little interest in sci-fi are probably vaguely, tangentially aware of the Strugatsky just because of Stalker, right? Because
Right.
it is such a iconic film, and Tarkovsky obviously occupies this kind of secular sainthood
Right.
for cinephiles. But it's interesting that they are so this film that they are so their deepest penetration into the culture, if you like, is basically nothing to do. Well, nothing is strong. Is quite little to do with their original conception. And I mean, if
Right.
you're talking about Sakura, the film Days of Eclipse, I presume is what you're referring to, even less. I
Right.
mean, like the Sakura film is
Yeah, just kind of the
notes
main
on a
his
theme
last name,
of
surname is
the
Captain,
Strugatsky. Yeah,
and maybe it's a more general, atmosphere and in the case of Sakurov, I think, I mean, we're definitely talking about kind of being inspired by the work and respect. In the case of Tarkovsky, you know, of course, we always have to take with a great grain of salt everything that, Tarkovsky said. But yeah, he was not a fan of sci-fi. That's not the project that he wanted to work on, and sort of, he chose these projects again because they were sort of, they could sell, and then ultimately turning them into his own. And that's true both in the case of Stalker and the case of Solaris. But that raises again the interesting question of sort of how well their books land themselves to film adaptability and to screen, right? 'Cause I mean, another major, adaptation of their work, and it's of Hard to Be a God
oh yeah,
by Guillermin, which again, I mean, it is closer to the text, to some extent, but at the same time, also it's also very, very different. And again, Guillermin a great director in his own right, was doing his own thing.
This is
Uh,
Alexei German, and this
Alexei
is
German, right? And it's
2015 that was it 2013, 2015 that that film was finally completed because he worked on
yeah,
it for kind of
completed after his
decades.
death, right,
Yeah,
by his son, but he wanted to, make it since the 1960s, and it was almost ready to go into production that early on, really in cooperation with the Strugatskys, but couldn't do it, and then returned to it and really saw it as his kind of masterwork, and it turned out to be kind of his swan song. A fascinating film, a very difficult film to watch. Um, but again, we're talking essentially about two different works of art, the book and the film. And there were some more popular. For instance, what I think their great book, Monday Starts on Saturday, which is one of their kind of more comical books, but also I think having a real depth. So there was a very, very popular adaptation, again, incredibly loose adaptation. It was actually a musical.
yeah.
It was always shown kind of New Year's Eve, in the Soviet
Is that
Union.
Sorcerers
The Sorcerer's Right.
by Bromberg?
Yes, popular, and but again, incredibly like in terms of fidelity, a super loose adaptation. Maybe the Dead Mountaineers Hotel uh is it's a more obscure film, an Estonian film. There's a greater deal of kind of correspondence to the novel, right?
I was gonna say, is there actually an adaptation that is what's the word faithful to
Yeah.
the Strugatskys, or which really taps into their particular worldview? Would you say Dead Mountaineers Hotel, which is the kind of murder mystery sci-fi?
Right.
The
Yeah.
film was made by Grigory Komarov in Estonia
Estonia.
at
Right.
the end of the 70s.
It is certainly, yeah. I mean, it certainly is, there's closeness to the text with some changes, but there's a greater degree of fidelity. There's also, for instance, uh, an adaptation of their novel Inhabited Island
Mm.
by Bondarchuk from the early 2000s, and it's kind of this blockbuster.
Yeah, I was going to say
Uh,
a very different, much more regrettable take on that.
yeah, although Boris liked it, I mean,
Really?
it's bizarre.
I have to say, I find that very surprising.
I did too. When I read that, and the character there is Max Kemmerer, character that they have in a number of their works, and they were like, "Yeah, that's exactly how we envisioned him." Perhaps he was being sarcastic. I
Well,
don't know.
for people who don't know, Fyodor Bondarchuk, who made this, I think the English title of his film is Dark Planet or something, like you say. It's an
Something
adaptation
like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
of a
yeah.
novel called Inhabited Island,
Right, right,
which and Bondarchuk is, I don't want to slander him, but he's basically one of the premier purveyors of this kind of schmaltzy Putin era, increasingly
right.
nationalistic blockbuster stuff that very regrettably has taken over the Russian film industry. So
Yeah,
the idea that a very elderly Boris Strugatsky was popping down to the multiplex and enjoying Dark Planet in
yeah,
2008 is quite, I have to say, quite strange. One thing
yeah,
that we've made kind of maybe passing reference to is the way that they kind of pursued themes across their career but arrived at increasingly cynical conclusions. And one way I think to illustrate that, which we have already touched on, but just because I want to talk about the film in more detail because I'm so fascinated by it, is to kind of talk about the film of Hard to Be a God by Alexei German, and then talk about the book that it's based on, which is part of this kind of it's called the Noon universe. I mean, we're all
yeah.
used to kind of cinematic universes these days. The Strugatskys
Right,
had this literary sci-fi universe, the Noon universe, which is this kind of, I forget how many, a number of novels and short
right,
stories, right, over a long period of time, set in this and expanding upon this kind of single shared universe, which has a number of themes running through it. And
right, right,
if you read the Noon books, you can kind of see, because it's a shared universe and because it's exploring this same set of themes, you can see their response to it changing over time. And then the film that eventually results in 2013 by Alexei German is one of the bleakest, most cynical, and most difficult to watch films ever made. So maybe that would be a good way of just touching on the theme. So I mean, the Noon universe, it's obviously very expansive, but let's just get a brief kind of intro to that to get us up to the German film.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah. So right. So in their early works, they still have this, pretty utopian vision, right? And they imagine the future, it's like 22nd century, and this universe where again they take this from Yefremov, this writer I mentioned, essentially, where communism has triumphed, and there's this harmony, and human beings are better. Although even in
Mm,
those early works, they already allow some complexity. And so when we come to, hard to be a god, which, only ostensibly is part of the known universe because they do something so different in their work. They have this type of a character that they call progressor,
right.
obviously coming from the
That's the
word
one.
progress. And progressors are essentially historians, in the future, very much trained in this kind of Marxist view of history. So, humanity going through these various stages, essentially arriving at where they're supposed to arrive. And so, what these progressors do, they come to different planets where their role is to observe society, right? Just to observe. And the key is not to interfere.
Like ethnographers, basically.
Ethnographers, right? And again, the idea is that all societies are subject to the same laws that
Right.
govern them, right? So no matter where you are, whatever planet you're on, you can say, okay, this is what's happening. This is where they're going to be, at such and such a point, etc. And so what we have in Hard to Be God, we have these progressors who end up on this planet Arkanar, which is in this kind of deeply feudal period, right? So it's in this medieval period, but and the allegory is so transparent, it's hard not to see, and the readers who were reading that book in the 60s absolutely saw that the Strugatskys were depicting a Stalinist society, right? So we're
Mm,
now, it's kind of we're at the end of the thaw, and they see what is happening, that Khrushchev is beginning to kind of come back to this repressive mode of governance and really threatening and going after these young writers, intellectuals, and they're afraid, the Strugatskys are afraid that the Soviet Union is going to get back to the kind of the terror of the 1930s. And this is what they depict this Arkanar as, right? As this society that is on the verge of becoming, deeply totalitarian, where terror will overtake everything and really destroy the minds, destroy the intellectuals,
yeah,
destroy the,
it's they should be basically they according to this teleological view of history, they should be basically about to have the Renaissance, and
yeah,
it's
and
been deferred. They're stuck
exactly,
in the Dark Ages. This kind of
exactly.
intellectual enlightenment has
Right.
failed to materialize.
It's not going to happen. And the main character, Rumata, right, who's a progressor, and the dilemma that he faces is whether he should interfere or not, right? He faces this evil that kind of stares him in the face. He realizes that all these laws that he thought should govern societies, that's just nonsense. That's not how human beings operate, right?
Mm,
So it is an assault on this kind of Marxist idea of history. At the same time, in Hard to Be a God, the Strugatskys are still clinging to this idea that there is goodness to be found in the idea of culture, right? There is
mm,
still hope. Uh, there is still a possibility of kind of getting out of this swamp that they're in, and you do that. Well, you do that through poetry. You do that through literature, right? You
mm.
do that. You do that through art. But if you look at the film, as you said, it is an incredibly pessimistic work where the main character Rumata, he's just so thoroughly cynical and has just resigned himself to the idea that just like nothing can be changed, nothing matters. right? Which German depicts as this, yeah, sort of the medieval society with all of its dirt and
Yeah,
smells
it's
and
impossible to describe the sensory experience of the film if you haven't seen it.
yeah,
It's
and it's suffocating, and it's just, you just,
it's
essentially kind of
mud and
humanity is
rain,
animals, right?
spit and
Yes,
shit and
and all of that stuff, right? And
squelching.
um, so yes, they're quite different. But as I said, in that book, they're still clinging to that idea that there's a way out, and then they also dispense with that and come up with another, I think, another idea of what can kind of preserve civilization, essentially.
Yeah, I just think it's a really key both text and also film for thinking about this idea of progress and the optimism and cynicism that kind of circulate around that idea of progress. But one thing that I can't let you go without asking you about, because it's something that you've written so much about and thought so much about, is, and something which I think is not commented on very frequently with Strugatsky's, is the Jewish aspect to their work. You've written a lot about Soviet Jewish culture and experience and history. So yeah, I mean, just I'll ask it in a pretty open way. I mean, in what ways should we think about the Strugatskys as Jewish artists? In what ways is it important to kind of take that aspect of their identities into consideration when we talk about all of this, whether that's on the page or on the screen? I mean,
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah, great question. And as you said, yes, I have been writing about that aspect and writing a book about it now. Um, so it's just as a way of, prefacing sort of about the place of Jews and Jewishness in Soviet society during this period. So, on the page, Jews are recognized as a legitimate ethnicity, within the Soviet society. Yiddish is recognized as a Jewish language. And I emphasize, ethnicity, Judaism as a religion, just like all religions in the Soviet Union, essentially destroyed and allowed to exist in a very, very
right.
oppressed form. Most of Soviet Jews, by the 1960s are, you know, fully acculturated, assimilated into the overall society, speaking Russian or sometimes Ukrainian, or but still having a very distinct sense of themselves as Jews. But that recognition, as I said, of them as an ethnicity is very much on the page. What is happening in real life, you have this constant oppression on the part of the regime, which expressed itself in various ways directed against Jews. But even apart from this kind of widespread anti-Semitism, what you have is just that there is absolutely no public space for expressing one's Jewishness. And so Soviet Jews had to find ways of somehow, expressing who they are and learning about who they are, right? And so one way of doing that was through literature, was through books. And so sci-fi was right in the middle of it, which is why I think about, Soviet sci-fi during this period, 60s, 70s, 80s, at least quite a few representatives of sci-fi, as really as a Jewish space. I mean, so many of these major sci-fi authors were Jewish, and they really infused so much of that into their work. And the Strugatskys absolutely did as well, right? So I
It's
think
that
they,
allegorical aspect of sci-fi again,
that
right? Right.
allegorical aspect, right? And sometimes just really, explicitly having not just Jewish characters, but contemplations of Jewish history, Jewish place in the world, etc. And so, a lot of that had to do with memory of the Holocaust and the legacy of the Holocaust, which again, in the Soviet Union, despite the fact that the legacy of World War II, what was called Great Patriotic Work in the Soviet lingo, was such a huge part of everything. But the Holocaust, as a Jewish catastrophe, was absolutely silenced, overlooked. It was, that memory was erased if we look at the official historiography. At the same time, you had a number of works that were officially published during the thaw period that addressed that, and the Strugatskys come to the Holocaust constantly, right? From as early as, so that first work that they saw is really serious, Escape Attempt, where again they have these, it's Noon Universe, 22nd century, and you have these progressors who end up on another planet, and that planet looks exactly like a camp, right? It's either Auschwitz or the Soviet Stalinist camp, and along with them comes this character from the 20th century, who is Jewish and who escapes from a concentration camp, right? And these Noon Universe characters, when they confront this evil on that planet, they don't know what to do with it, right? Because they've never experienced anything like that. And he's the only one who immediately recognizes for what it is, right? He says it's just like the gas chambers of Auschwitz, right? So so the Strugatskys constantly kind of bring the Holocaust, sometimes in more explicit ways, sometimes in more covert ways, into their work. And then, for them, this Jewishness really, it reaches sort of philosophical, I would say, theological dimensions, especially in the book that they absolutely could not publish, and that's The Doomed City, and which was, translated into English, and it came out just a few years ago, wonderful translation by Andrew Bromfield, which they saw as their masterwork, their masterpiece. And just briefly, so, it talks about the kind of this matrix city that exists somewhere where people from all over the world, from different historical periods, somehow end up there. They all speak different languages, but somehow understand each other. And that city goes through these different historical periods, yeah, and they kind of jumble up all of Soviet history, their 20th century history there. But one of the main characters in that book is Isaac Katzman, this absolutely overtly Jewish character through and through, who they, as I've written about it, they present as kind of this Jewish Socrates,
Right.
yeah, this Jewish philosopher who comes up with this idea of how civilization can be saved, right? And for him, civilization can be saved um, only through kind of the select few, the intellectuals, right? Who can protect themselves from the rest of society and build up this tower of civilization. Yeah. It's these outsiders, who do that. And again, the idea of outsiderhood and Jewishness is very much linked, right? So that really becomes their philosophy. Again, Strugatskys, they never really talked about that, you know. They always acknowledged, that they were Jews, and later Boris wrote about anti-Semitism, but in very limited ways. But their works speak for themselves.
Well, there's so much more to discuss, and I think we
Yeah,
could
yeah.
probably have several more podcasts getting into these tangents to do with sci-fi outside of the Soviet Union, Jewish culture within and without. But I think for now, we'll leave it there. Marat Greenberg, thanks so much for talking to us about the Strugatsky brothers.
Thank you. Wonderful to speak with you. That was great.